There's a moment, and I've seen it happen exactly once in my life, where a room goes so quiet you can actually hear people hold their breath. Not the dramatic movie kind of quiet, the real kind, where everyone around you suddenly becomes very still, very careful, like they're afraid that if they move even an inch, they'll break something that can't be put back together. I was standing about 12 feet away when it happened. And I still think about it. Years later, I still think about it. It was a Thursday in late October, one of those London mornings that can't decide what it wants to be. Cold, but not properly cold. Gray, but with these thin patches of light breaking through in a way that almost feels like a trick. The kind of day where you button your coat at the top, and then regret it 20 minutes later. I've been assigned to cover a small press event at St. James's Palace, not Buckingham, the other one. The older one, with the red brick and the Tudor gatehouse that looks like something out of a history book you had to memorize in school. My editor wanted background footage for a longer piece we were doing on ceremonial protocols. Nothing exciting, just context material. I had a camera, a notepad, and a thermos of tea that had gone lukewarm before I even left the flat. There were perhaps 30 or 40 people gathered in the area outside, a handful of press, some official-looking staff moving in and out of the entrance. A few tourists who'd wandered over from the mall, sensing something was happening without quite knowing what. The kind of mix you always get at these low-key royal engagements, people with lanyards and people with guidebooks standing shoulder to shoulder. 2 guards were posted at the gatehouse entrance, both in full ceremonial dress, the deep red tunics, the tall bearskin caps, the black boots that catch the light even on a dull morning, standing exactly as they always stand. Shoulders back, gaze forward, faces arranged into that expression that isn't quite blank but isn't quite anything else either. Disciplined. Completely, utterly disciplined. The one on the left, I'll call him the younger one because that's what he looked, late 20s maybe, was the one I found myself watching. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Journalists get that sometimes. Something in the way he was standing told me he was concentrating very hard on standing exactly that way. The event was supposed to be brief. A small delegation being received, some ceremonial formality, in and out. The kind of thing the palace does dozens of times a year without anyone particularly noticing. Camilla and I want to be careful here because what happened next is important enough that the details matter. Arrived a little after 10 o'clock. Not for this particular event specifically, but the timing overlapped. She was passing through the area, moving between engagements, accompanied by 2 members of her personal staff and a protection officer walking 2 steps behind. She looked exactly as she always does in person, composed, a little more weathered than photographs suggest, and I mean that as a compliment. There's something grounded about her in person, something that photographs somehow flatten out. She was wearing a deep green wool coat. Her hair was set. Her expression was that particular kind of focused calm that people in public life learn, the face they wear when they're moving through spaces where they know everyone is looking. She paused near the gatehouse. I wasn't close enough to hear the initial exchange. There was ambient noise, a vehicle moving nearby, someone talking on a phone behind me, but I saw her turn her attention toward the younger guard. Her staff member leaned in and said something. Camilla nodded. And then she looked at the guard more directly. What I pieced together afterward from 2 people who were standing closer than I was. The request, and request might be too soft a word for it, was that the guard should kneel. Not as any kind of formal ceremony, more in the nature of an acknowledgement, a gesture of deference. The reasoning, as I understood it later, was that someone in her party had apparently suggested it. Some notion about tradition, about the proper form, about what was expected in that moment. I can't speak to exactly where it came from or whether Camilla herself fully endorsed it or was simply allowing it to proceed. These things are rarely as clear-cut in the moment as they seem in the retelling. But the request was there, and the guard heard it. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. The guard didn't move, not a flinch, not a flicker of the eyes. He stayed exactly as he was, shoulders back, gaze forward, bearskin level. Like the words had simply moved past him the way wind moves past a stone wall. And then very quietly, very evenly, he spoke. I didn't hear every word, but the person standing directly to my left, a photographer I'd worked alongside before, good man, very reliable, later told me what he heard, and I have no reason to doubt him. The guard said in words close to these, "My duty is to stand, ma'am. I'm afraid kneeling is not within my orders." That was it, no edge to it. No defiance that you could point to and call out. No trembling, no apology, no over-explanation. Just a clean, level statement of fact, delivered in a voice quiet enough that only the immediate circle could hear it. And then he went back to being exactly what he had been a moment before. Still composed, present. The silence afterward was the thing. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, long enough to feel very long. Camilla's expression changed. It was a small change, the kind of thing you'd miss if you blinked, but I was watching and I caught it. Something moved behind her eyes, something that was not anger, something closer to, and I've turned this over many times, a kind of recalibration. Like a person who has just encountered something unexpected and is quietly deciding what to make of it. Her staff member looked at the ground for a moment. The protection officer remained exactly as he was. And then Camilla did something that honestly surprised me more than anything else that morning. She nodded, slightly but genuinely. Not the dismissive nod of someone moving on from an awkward moment, something more considered than that. She said something else, only one word, maybe two, that I couldn't catch. And then she continued on her way, her coat moving against her legs as she walked, her staff falling back into position behind her. The whole thing was over in under a minute. But the people who had seen it weren't moving on quite so quickly. I turned to the photographer beside me. He had his camera at his side. He was looking at the guard. "Did you get that?" I asked him. He shook his head. Camera was down. He said it without frustration, just as a fact. We both looked at the guard for another moment. The guard was not looking at either of us. He was looking at whatever guards look at, that fixed point somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the morning, beyond everything that had just happened around him. "How does he do that?" the photographer said, not really to me. I didn't answer because I didn't have one. Here is what I've thought about since then. There's a version of that story where the guard is a hero in a simple way, where he stands up to power, holds his ground, refuses to bow. And people like that version because it's clean, because it has a clear shape. But I'm not sure it's quite right. What struck me wasn't defiance. Defiance has heat in it. What that guard produced had no heat at all. It was something more difficult than defiance. It was dignity, the kind that doesn't need to make a point to have one. He wasn't refusing in order to make anyone uncomfortable. He wasn't performing. He wasn't calculating the moment or thinking about how it would look. He was simply and completely what he was, a man in a position with a defined duty, and he knew exactly what that duty required and what it did not require, and he said so, gently and plainly, without drama. That's actually very hard to do. Most of us in that moment would have done one of two things. Either we would have bent, told ourselves it was just a small thing, not worth the friction, easier to go along. Or we would have refused in a way that made our refusal into a statement, into something pointed, into the beginning of a confrontation. He did neither. He simply told the truth of his position, without embellishment and without softening it into something dishonest. And then he was still. I spoke to a retired guardsman about 3 weeks after this happened. I didn't tell him what I'd witnessed. I asked him more generally about what the training is like, what they're told about moments of pressure. He said something I've not forgotten. He said, "They tell you very early on that the uniform is not about you. Your feelings don't live in the uniform. Your preferences don't live in the uniform. Your pride doesn't live in the uniform. Your duty lives there. Everything else you leave at the gate." He laughed a little when he said it, the way people laugh at things that are both true and slightly absurd. "Sounds simple," I said. "Sounds simple," he agreed. "Isn't." Later that afternoon, back at the office, I tried to write up notes from the morning. The official event had produced nothing particularly interesting. Some handshakes, some brief exchanges, background material that would slot into the piece without anyone noticing it. Standard stuff. But I kept coming back to those 4 seconds. I wrote a sentence about it and then deleted it. Wrote it again, deleted it again. Part of the problem was that I wasn't sure what the story was. A guard declined a request. He was polite about it. Everything continued. There was no conflict, no injury, no aftermath to report. In terms of events, very little had happened. But something had happened, something that's harder to name. I think what I witnessed was a person who had found, at the center of himself, a place that was genuinely immovable. Not because he was rigid or cold, Not because he didn't understand the situation, but because he knew, with that particular clarity, that most of us spend our whole lives reaching for exactly what he was and what he was not, what his duty contained and what it did not, and there was simply no gap in that knowledge for uncertainty to get through. Most people never find that place, or they find it briefly and then lose it again. I went back to St. James's on a different morning about a month later. No assignment, just went. I'm not entirely sure why. The guards at the gatehouse were different. Of course they were. They rotate. The morning was clearer than before, properly cold by then, the kind of cold that makes the red of the tunics look even more saturated against the gray stone. I stood on the pavement and watched for a few minutes. Tourists moved around me, taking photographs, speaking in languages I couldn't identify. A child pointed at the guards and tugged at her father's sleeve. The guards didn't acknowledge her. They didn't look at her. They remained exactly what they were. And I found myself thinking again about that moment, about the man who had simply said, "My duty is to stand," about the 4 seconds of silence that followed, about the slight nod that Camilla had given before she moved on. I've covered a fair amount of royal engagements over the years. Palace events, ceremonial occasions, formal visits. You see a lot of things in those settings that you don't entirely know how to categorize. But that October morning sits differently in my memory from the rest of it. Not because anything dramatic happened, because almost nothing happened. A man stood where he was supposed to stand. He said what was true. He went back to standing. And somehow that small, quiet thing has stayed with me longer than many far larger ones. I think it's because dignity, real dignity, is rarer than we pretend it is. We talk about it often. We invoke it in speeches and tributes. But when you actually see it, unperformed, unprompted in a moment where it would have been far easier to bend, it does something to you. It recalibrates something. I don't know that guard's name. I never found it out. I wouldn't publish it if I did. It's not that kind of story. But I think about him sometimes on ordinary mornings. On the days when there's some small pressure to compromise something, to smooth something over, to let a small truth go rather than hold it carefully in place. I think about a man in a red tunic on a gray Thursday morning, shoulders back, gaze forward, completely and quietly sure of exactly what he was. And I think that's the thing to aim for, not the grand gesture, not the dramatic refusal. Just the calm, clear knowledge of where you stand, and the willingness to stay there, without heat, without apology, and without flinching. His duty was to stand. So he stood,